Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Executive Director and Founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, David Becker.
Thank you all. Welcome here to the beautiful International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. And those of you watching remotely don't get to see the beautiful views that we see of Washington on this gorgeous day here in May. Also, it's so wonderful to see so many people here in person. Many friends and colleagues I've known for a long time, many people I haven't seen for years or even met in person ever. So thank you all for being here today. When I founded CEIR almost 7 years ago in the summer of 2016, the field of election administration was very different. Cyber threats were at the forefront. Experts' concerns mainly consisted of foreign actors attempting to illegally access voter databases or spread disinformation overseas. Election officials were not only free from threats or harassment, election officials had a hard time getting anyone to notice them or understand what they did. Election conferences all over the country were boring, right? We'd mostly discuss best practices for things like recruiting and training poll workers. CEIR's work at its inception was focused primarily on those nuts and bolts of elections, like research on cybersecurity and voter list maintenance. In 2016, for context, about 1 in 4 ballots nationally had no paper record at all. The entire states of Georgia and South Carolina had only unauditable digital ballots, as well as most of North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and other states as well. Effective audits of paper ballots were relatively rare. And over months, for the first time in our history in 2016, a major party's candidate for president began using language even before the election that the election would be rigged. When President Trump won, there were some supporters of Secretary Clinton who raised concerns about possible tampering with voting machines. While she did not pursue those claims or request recounts, others did, and yet every investigation confirmed the results. I was among the first who stated publicly that there was no evidence of any problem with ballot counting in the 2016 presidential election. I stated then, and the fact remains, that President Trump won the election. Many supporters of Secretary Clinton were disappointed in the result, but the election was conducted fairly and transparently according to the rules that were established prior to Election Day. Over the next 4 years, as we all know, a lot changed in the democracy space. False claims about widespread voter fraud were amplified by the White House itself. And once again, no evidence of fraud could be found or produced. But while that was happening, election officials, many of whom are in this room right now, were improving and professionalizing this field to the highest level ever achieved. States without paper ballots moved on a bipartisan basis towards paper ballots and moved towards requiring stronger audits than the nation had ever seen before. By 2020, 95% of all ballots were paper, including every battleground state and the entire states of Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Virginia. Additional states came together to ensure their voter lists were more accurate. And our work evolved as well. We conducted more research and engaged with the media more often to ensure voters were aware of these improvements and the overall integrity of the election system. Despite major challenges like insufficient funding and resources, election officials were ready heading into the 2020 election. And then COVID hit. It was a crisis that election officials had never experienced before and couldn't have planned for. The pandemic began just as primaries were heating up. While voters were understandably fearful for their own safety and consumed with concern for their loved ones, election officials felt the same, while also having to invent how to run an election in a global pandemic. This meant facilitating the most social of democratic functions, voting, while accommodating social distancing. Yet somehow, against all odds, the hundreds of thousands of election officials and volunteers in thousands of different jurisdictions pulled it off. When they had problems during the primaries, they learned their lessons and planned accordingly for the general election. When legislators at federal and state level failed to provide needed funding for new expenses that couldn't be anticipated, election officials partnered with philanthropy. When voters needed more ways to vote safely, election officials worked with their states to expand those options. When huge numbers of experienced poll workers couldn't work because they were at higher risk of contracting the virus, election officials recruited and trained new ones from lower risk groups. When election officials needed larger voting locations to accommodate social distancing, they partnered with sports arenas and other large venues to ensure their voters and workers were as comfortable and safe as possible. They pulled this all off when rules and procedures were constantly in flux, changing under their feet, often challenged in court, as both political parties sought an advantage. As it turned out, Republicans won approximately 85% of the pre-election litigation, but whatever side you were on, everyone knew the rules on Election Day, and the election officials around the country were ready. In November 2020, nearly 160 million Americans turned out to vote. That's 20 million more ballots than had ever been cast in any election in American history. 2 out of 3 eligible voters showed up. That's the highest turnout the nation had seen since well before women were guaranteed the right to vote. Even with unprecedented scrutiny, legal challenges, and unsubstantiated claims of fraud while the votes were still being counted, the work of election officials withstood that harsh scrutiny. The November 2020 election was, simply put, the most secure, transparent, and verified presidential election in American history, and it's not close. Despite being held in the middle of a global pandemic, the 2020 election stands as one of the great accomplishments of American resilience and know-how. This remains true regardless of whether one is happy with the result. But like many of our nation's greatest achievements, there are those who seek to profit from spreading conspiracy theories that deny the facts. It's been over 30 months since that 2020 election, 917 days to be exact. And while there are debunked claims of German servers and bamboo ballots still circulating on social media, there has still not been one shred of evidence presented to any court about any significant problems. Conservative legal scholars have reviewed every claim, all of the allegations and evidence, and concluded that the 2020 election was lost, not stolen. Even efforts by well-funded and motivated supporters of the losing presidential candidate in places like Arizona and Wisconsin could not find or manufacture evidence that the election was not legitimate. Yet the lies have not let up. Even after over 900 days, even after election denial has proven to be a failed political strategy, with election deniers losing nearly every contested race in 2022, not only are the lies continuing, we're seeing them ramp up. Threats and harassment of election officials continue, and we're experiencing an unprecedented exodus from the field. From California to Pennsylvania and everywhere in between, dedicated public servants are asking themselves whether it's worth it. Is it worth the constant, unrelenting harassment and abuse just to serve as a civil servant? And yet most of them are still answering yes. It inspires me every single day. And our work at CEIR will continue to evolve and meet this moment. No matter what, we will serve the needs of those professionals, the men and women who ensure that every eligible voter gets a voice in our democracy. Our team has grown. We're releasing more research to the field than ever. We're planning to release several reports, so be on the lookout for them later this month, even later this week. On topics as diverse as the quality of voter lists, the security of voter registration systems, the effects of new laws on election officials, and the depth of election denial among some Americans. We're working with the media and the public to educate them about the voting process, even holding a public focus group in Arizona with citizens who doubt the integrity of elections. We're responding to efforts by election deniers to bully election officials and isolate them from their networks with convenings such as this one and other efforts. And we are working to protect those men and women, our neighbors, our family members, who serve as election officials, whether it's a Secretary of State or down to volunteer poll workers, through our election official legal defense network, which provides pro bono legal assistance and advice to election officials all across the country, regardless of party, co-chaired by former Obama White House counsel Bob Bauer and former Romney and Bush campaign counsel Ben Ginsburg. And we've helped dozens of election officials over the last 2 years. I'll just say, while I'm very proud that CEIR has been able to provide this service, it breaks my heart that this service is necessary in a 21st century democracy. We remain committed to working with the many election officials and others from across the political spectrum who remain committed to the ideal that facts matter, that integrity matters, and that the will of the voters matters, even when we disagree with the voters' will, perhaps particularly when we disagree with the voters' will. In this room, we have election officials from Maine to California. We invited every single chief election official across the country, Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal, to this convening. We have Republicans and Democrats here. We have Trump voters and Biden voters in this room. And over the next day and a half, we'll come together to discuss challenges, best practices, and long-term solutions. While there may be disagreements about policy in this room, and we invite those disagreements, there is one thing that unites us all: the belief that democracy must persist and thrive, and that it must reflect the will of the people. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. It is wonderful to be in a room with you all. Thank you. And I particularly want to thank the many of you in this room who serve in a role of election administration. Again, there are secretaries of state in here, there are county level officials, there are local officials. Many people don't recognize the fact that you don't show up on the Monday before an election and set up the machines, that you're working 365 to prepare for elections, and honestly, you're working harder than ever. And despite the attacks, your work still is withstanding any scrutiny anyone wants to apply. It's remarkable. You are being held to an unprecedented standard of perfection, and you're coming as close as anyone could reasonably expect. And again, your work inspires me every day. It's why I do what I do. With that, we're going to head to our first panel, so you don't have to keep listening to me talk. Our first panel is